So here's why the Dallas Mavericks can beat the Boston Celtics. Here's their path to victory in this series. One, let's start just off the top and look at the Dallas Mavericks as a team and a commodity here as the way they're priced heading into this finals. You have to remember one thing about the Dallas Mavericks. The current iteration of this team that is now in the NBA Finals is not the same team that we saw for the first 4 months of the NBA regular season. And in fact, really, you can kind of almost discard everything you've seen about the Dallas Mavericks prior to the trade deadline, prior to the additions of Goddard and Washington coming on to the Dallas Mavericks and providing them with the defensive effort that they needed in order to improve this team. Prior to then, that team doesn't exist anymore. So this is a Dallas team now that's been hard to figure out, hard to price, because we don't really know how much of what we have seen in this post-trade deadline iteration of the Mavericks is consistent with what we've seen all year long, because the numbers don't always tell you that story. They don't always jump out and tell you the story that all of a sudden, hey, this team is better when it comes to defensive efficiency. This team is now better when it comes to both ends of the floor and playing the game of basketball. So I think Dallas is still a little bit undervalued here, and clearly the toughest team that Boston will have faced on this path. I'm not knocking Boston for the path they had. They're the number one seed. They got here because they won 62 games, so they have been rewarded with an easier path, but they just haven't faced a team that is the caliber on both ends of the floor of the Dallas Mavericks. So I think we're undervaluing Dallas here a little bit. Now, obviously, a lot of this will boil down to Luka Doncic and what he is able to do. I think we all agree he's the best player on the floor in this series. Now, being the best player on the floor and putting up the numbers that correlate to you being the best player on the floor might be two different conversations. Will it take Luka to have games similar to what we saw from LeBron James in games 5, 6, and 7 when the Cavs came back on the Warriors? I would think you would need 3 of those games from Luka in this series to be able to win this thing. I find it hard to believe, as much as I think Dallas can win this series, that they would do it in anything less than 6 games. So this is going to be a little bit of a longer series, but Luka clearly has to assert himself game in and game out as the best player on the floor. If he continues to do that in every single game, he's going to keep his team in manageable situations to win the game late. Remember, go back to what Boston did against Indiana. We know that they swept them. That's the big picture. But clearly Boston could have lost game 1, certainly could have lost game 3, and heck, there was a reason they could have lost game 4. All of those games were tight. And that's the situation that Dallas wants to create down the stretch. The same thing that they did to Minnesota when Minnesota had a lead with under 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter in all those games. And guess what Dallas went out and did? They won them. So they've got to give themselves a chance. And the only way they give themselves a chance is for Luka to play at his highest level and continue to be the best player on the floor. Now, when we talk about sort of the rest of the team, or at least the 1-2 punch, when we think of the Celtics, we think of Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. There's an argument, and I believe this is true, that the Mavericks 1-2 of Luka and Kyrie in their best form is better than the 1-2 that the Boston Celtics have out there with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And there's an argument that Kyrie could be, in certain instances and stretches that we've seen from him, the second best player on the floor. And we certainly know what Kyrie has the ability to do. And if he can play at the level that we've seen him play, that at the level that he's capable of, if he can play, and again, I go back to his time in Cleveland with LeBron James, because LeBron and Luka bring similar skill sets in what they can do as far as shooting, scoring, and passing. He has that similar type player, Kyrie does, in Luka as he did at LeBron, and that was the best version we saw of Kyrie night in and night out. And I think you can get that here. So the 1-2 punch for Dallas on its best nights, and could be 4 games out of 7, better than the 1-2 punch that the Boston Celtics are putting there. Now, this is one of the big cruxes for Dallas in this series is their defense. And how much is that aforementioned trade deadline acquisitions, and how much has this team really improved on the defensive end? Because what we know about Boston is 2 things. They have a ton of depth, and they have a ton of shooting. I mean, for crying out loud, we watched a game where crepity old Al Horford made 7 3-pointers in a game that helped the Boston Celtics win against the Indiana Pacers. That's the kind of thing that literally can't happen when it comes to this series for the Dallas Mavericks. They have got to do a fantastic job defensively of limiting the Boston shooting and limiting the Boston depth. Like, there's a game, it feels like, where Derek White in every series comes out and nails 5 3-pointers, and everybody's sitting here going, why didn't they cover that guy? Well, Yeah, why didn't they cover that guy? So Dallas doesn't have that luxury. And then you add in Kristaps Porzingis and what he knows, and Dallas fans know very well what he's capable of and the type of player that he can be. And it's going to change things very dynamically defensively for Dallas because guess what? Kristaps rather can sit in the middle and play with his back to the basket when he needs to. He also steps out behind the three-point line and nails three-pointers from there. So it's a tough ask. Dallas does not have a lot of room defensively to make mistakes against this Boston team. I think every under in this series will favor Dallas because literally that's the best way for them to win this game. If we start to see Boston floating in the 110, 112, 114 and above type numbers, then guess what? It's going to be tough for Dallas to win these games. They have got to do what they did to Minnesota, and Minnesota is nowhere near as good a team as Boston is offensively, but they've got to be able to keep them into that 105 range. If they can do that, if they can get the pace to slow, they're going to have a very good chance again to win these games. Do you want to be in a shootout with Boston where you're putting shooter on shooter at the end of the game? That's probably not in Dallas's favor. So they're going to need to, the Mavericks are going to need to do their best to close out on shooters and stop them defensively and hope that Boston just has some off shooting nights. We've seen it happen before from Boston. It happened in the Indiana series. It certainly happened against Miami. It happened against Cleveland. They had that one stinker game. And oh, by the way, if Boston does have that one stinker game and the Mavericks go ahead and roll them, it's going to be a huge emotional lift for them and maybe what they need to help push them over the top here. So we've talked about a couple of different things here. Let's talk about depth versus depth because I just mentioned what Boston has. Well, Dallas equally is as deep. They have got players. They're just not the commodities that everybody knows that Boston has. So Dallas has got to rely on their depth and be able to get more points from guys other than Luka and Kyrie and continue to find ways to make Boston frustrated on the defensive end. And I think the depth portion of this thing is where Dallas gets a little bit underrated, and they are a team that I truly believe has the ability to use the rest of their bench and use it to their advantage. And that kind of parlays into the last angle, which may be one of the biggest edges, is that Jason Kidd has the coaching advantage over Joe Mazzulla. I think he's a better coach. I think he's a more experienced coach. I think he's been through these series before. And oh, by the way, all the pressure resides with Joe Mazzulla and the Boston Celtics. It doesn't reside with Jason Kidd and the Dallas Mavericks. To a certain extent, there are a lot of people may feel Dallas didn't even belong to be here. They should, they were not the best team in the Western Conference. They just, got here through some grit and a little bit of luck. Beyond all that, I don't think we can dismiss the fact that Jason Kidd is the better coach here and that Jason Kidd can be the X factor for the Dallas Mavericks here and really outcoach Joe Mazzulla. And you'll find out really who the better coach is very quickly when Boston starts to have these little lulls in shooting, when they start to drag a little bit. What sort of buttons does Joe Mazzulla push? I think the battle-tested nature of Dallas, the fact that they had to go through Phoenix, they had to go through Oklahoma City, and they had to go through Minnesota. And oh, by the way, the last two of those teams are both top 5 defensive efficiency teams. Dallas is not scared to play a competent defensive team like Boston. They know that they can score. They know that they can do and run their offense the way they want to, and they don't have to worry about getting blown out because in reality, with the exception of a couple of spots against Oklahoma City, they were never down big. Dallas never got to a point where they were trailing by 12, 15 points in a given game. So they know that they can hang close with good defensive ball clubs like Oklahoma City and like Minnesota, and they certainly shouldn't be afraid to do it against the Boston Celtics. So those are all the reasons why the Dallas Mavericks can win and have a path to victory in the NBA Finals. If you agree or disagree with my theory on why the Dallas Mavericks can win the NBA title this year, drop a comment right down below. Let me know your thoughts on either side, whether you agree or disagree about the Dallas Mavericks. And if you'd like to see the reasons why the Boston Celtics are going to win the NBA title, check out this next game video.